on drug cartels.
Suspected drug boats heading into the U.S. to the waters off Central and South America.
I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country.
Deadly new airstrike obliterated a suspected drug boat.
It started as a ghost on radar, a 350-foot vessel drifting through the Pacific that was too slow for a warship and too large for a freighter. When U.S. drones closed in, what they saw defied belief. Inside were 6 drug laboratories, 8 chemical reactors, and more than 90 tons of narcotics worth over $12 billion. The true horror, however, was below deck, where 120 chained civilians, including 5 Americans, were forced to work until they collapsed. The cartel called it Jesús Malverde. The U.S. Navy called it a target, and what they did next shocked the whole world. The Shadow Fortress, Jesús Malverde, surfaces. For years, it was nothing more than a rumor. Intelligence circles got wind of a rumored ship that drifted through the Caribbean and Pacific, unseen by satellites and changing course every few weeks. Some called it a ghost factory, while others said it was a moving city of crime. But no one had proof. Every lead vanished into thin air, and every trail went cold. Until October 14, 2025, when a U.S. Navy P-8, a Poseidon aircraft, picked up something impossible. It was a massive heat signature, 130 miles west of Honduras, right in international waters. What began as a routine patrol had just uncovered a nightmare. The thermal readout was unlike anything analysts had ever seen. It was too hot, too dense, and too structured to be a ship. The Navy Command Center ran multiple scans, convinced it had to be a glitch. But the radar confirmed it. There was something enormous floating out there, moving at a steady speed of just 6 knots. When Task Force Trident analyzed the satellite images, the name sent a chill through every defense briefing room in Washington. The ship's code name was Jesús Malverde, named after the Mexican folk saint of drug traffickers. It was real. The ghost fortress existed. Stretching over 350 feet long, Jesús Malverde was not a vessel but a floating empire. Its decks were stacked with 6 industrial labs running day and night, converting raw materials into narcotics worth billions. 8 chemical reactors fed the process, spewing toxic fumes into the sea air. The cartel's engineers had modified everything for efficiency, with pipes, pumps, and ventilation all working like a mechanical heart of corruption. Below deck, storage rooms held staggering amounts of product. The ship contained 30 tons of heroin, 42 tons of cocaine, and 20 tons of crystal meth. At street value, the load was worth over $12 billion. The ship's outer walls had been reinforced with layers of scavenged naval armor, creating a crude but effective shield against gunfire and small explosions. Intelligence reports later confirmed it had radar scramblers, drone jammers, and its own internal surveillance grid. It was a self-contained nation of vice, built for one purpose: to flood the world with poison. But the darkest secret of Jesús Malverde wasn't the drugs, it was the people. Intelligence drones later revealed rows of chained workers deep below deck. 120 civilians from across Central and South America, including 5 Americans, had been kidnapped and forced to work 18-hour shifts. Men, women, and even teenagers were being used as disposable labor in a system that treated human lives as ingredients in production. Many had been missing for months, and their families believed they were lost at sea. In truth, they were prisoners of the floating fortress. At the center of it all was a Venezuelan fugitive, one of the world's most wanted men. He had disappeared from land years ago, slipping away after a failed assassination attempt by rival traffickers. Now he commanded his empire from the high seas, believing international law could never touch him. He surrounded himself with ex-Special Forces mercenaries, all armed with military-grade rifles, surface-to-air missiles, and night vision gear. They were not smugglers. They were soldiers of profit, trained and ready to die protecting the ship that made them rich. What made Jesús Malverde so dangerous was not just its firepower or fortune, but its mobility. It could drift across national boundaries, refuel at sea, and vanish into the vast ocean before anyone could act. But when those same mercenaries executed a U.S. Border Patrol officer, during an attempted seizure weeks earlier, everything changed. What had been a criminal operation was now a direct challenge to the United States. The message was clear. This was no longer about drugs. It was about defiance, and the response would be absolute. The world's largest floating drug fortress, guarded by an army of killers and holding hundreds hostage, had declared war on global stability. Now, a furious commander-in-chief would unleash the full, terrifying might of the U.S. military in an operation unlike any seen before. United States Fury, Operation Rain of Steel, unleashed. When word of the discovery reached Washington, the reaction was immediate. Military command centers went into lockdown, screens lit up with satellite feeds, intercepted communications, and high-resolution thermal scans of the massive vessel. Within minutes, the Pentagon classified it as a level red narcotic superstructure, the highest possible alert. That label was reserved for threats that combined organized crime, terrorism, and military-grade defenses. In plain terms, it was a floating weapon of mass destruction, and the world's most powerful military had no choice but to strike. The commander-in-chief was briefed in a secure situation room, and what he saw left him silent for a moment. A fortress of steel and corruption was holding American citizens hostage. When the briefing ended, his order was short and absolute. "I want that ship taken tonight." No debates, no hesitation. The mission was authorized under the name Operation Rain of Steel, and its goal was simple but daunting: capture or destroy the floating fortress and rescue the hostages. Every available branch of the armed forces would be drawn into the operation. By 2:12 a.m., the Pacific skies and seas were alive with quiet motion. Satellites realigned, submarines shifted course, and drones were armed and deployed. This was not a standard interdiction. It was a full-scale precision strike, plans of 7 to the millisecond with a mix of steel and stealth. Leading the first phase were 42 stealth suicide UAVs known as Spectre Hawks. These were cutting-edge aerial drones invisible to radar and equipped with AI-driven targeting systems. Their mission was to strike communication towers, surface weapons, and radar systems on the ship before the human teams even arrived. Beneath the waves, 24 Hammerhead X unmanned submarines moved into formation. These machines were the silent hunters of the deep, built for electronic warfare. They would jam enemy sensors, scramble GPS signals, and cut all communications, leaving the ship blind and deaf. At the same time, 6 Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines closed in. Each one was a predator of the ocean, capable of traveling quietly for days beneath the surface. They were now positioned within striking distance with their sonar locked on the target. Their objective was clear. If anything went wrong, they would unleash precision torpedoes to sink the fortress before it could escape. Above them, the human edge of the mission waited. 360 of the world's most elite warriors stood ready in their submersibles. They were Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators, trained to move unseen, strike fast, and finish the fight. Each team had rehearsed the operation dozens of times in simulation. They knew every deck layout, every lab, and every hostage location, and they were not expecting a simple fight. The cartel had fortified its ship with heavy guns and armored guards. But the U.S. was bringing in the kind of power no criminal force on Earth could match. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard cutter Stratton maintained a holding position miles away. Its crew would lead the humanitarian response after the assault with medical evacuations, hostage recovery, and evidence gathering. Every part of the mission had been mapped with surgical precision. As the final countdown began, the Commander-in-Chief's order echoed across the Pacific: execute Operation Rain of Steel. As that command traveled through encrypted channels, the silent U.S. Armada began to move. Beneath the dark waves and clouded skies, America's most advanced war machines closed in, preparing to bring Jesús Malverde to justice. What happened next would unfold with terrifying speed and precision, blinding the beast. At exactly 2:23 a.m., the first wave of Operation Rain of Steel began. The ocean was calm, the sky dark, and the enemy completely unaware that their nightmare had already started. Beneath the waves, the 24 Hammerhead X drones moved with machine precision, silent and unseen. Each one carried a unique task of jamming, hacking, and isolating the enemy ship. Within minutes, they formed what the Pentagon later described as an invisible cage, a digital trap from which no signal could escape. Inside the cartel's command room aboard Jesús Malverde, warning lights began flashing without reason. Operators shouted orders in confusion as their radar screens flickered, scrambled, then turned black. What had once been a floating fortress of control was now blind. The cartel's top radar engineer tried rebooting the system, but the screens came back only to show swirling static. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against them. Then came the second blow. Navigation systems started spinning out of control. The GPS readouts shifted from the Pacific to impossible coordinates across the globe. Digital compasses rotated endlessly, pointing in every direction. The ship had lost all sense of orientation. In the darkness, the Jesús Malverde began to drift, completely unaware of where it was heading. The captain's voice roared over the intercom, demanding updates, but no one could answer. At 2:28 a.m., every line of communication went dead. The radios only hissed with static, and satellite phones refused to connect. Even emergency distress signals failed to send. The cartel's ship had been silenced, and no orders could be received or any help requested. They were cut off from the world and locked in a digital prison. In just a few minutes, the most sophisticated smuggling vessel ever built had been stripped of its power. The massive ship that once represented the heart of a billion-dollar empire was now deaf, dumb, and blind, floating helplessly in the middle of nowhere. The psychological toll was immediate. Mercenaries who now stood confused, holding their weapons while surrounded by darkness and uncertainty. At 2:31 a.m., the next wave came. From above the clouds, the 42 stealth UAVs codenamed Spectre Hawks activated their attack routines. Invisible to radar and quieter than the wind, they descended upon the ship like precision-guided ghosts. Their onboard AI identified targets through body heat alone. Within 50 seconds, 38 armed guards fell where they stood. There were no alarms or gunfire, only small flashes of light and sudden silence. When it was over, the formerly busy deck of Jesús Malverde was now extremely calm. The outer defenses had been wiped out with chilling accuracy. The survivors below deck didn't yet know what had hit them, but fear had already spread. The ship now lay defenseless, blind, and broken. What came next would decide everything. The silent ghosts had done their part. Now it was time for America's most elite warriors to strike. Breaching the belly of the beast. The sea had gone quiet after the first strikes. On deck, mercenaries fired blindly into the night, shouting orders they could not hear and shooting at shadows. Without radar or radios, their world had collapsed into chaos and fear. They had no idea that the real enemy was already inside their hull. Beneath the waves, a dozen Virginia-class attack submarines slid into position. For hours, they had haunted the water like predators. Now they completed a slow, silent ascent. Their hulls broke the surface only enough to release small submersibles. The movement was so smooth that it left barely a ripple to anyone watching. From those submarines, men prepared to move. 360 operators climbed into dry submersibles and swimmer delivery vehicles. These craft crawled toward the fortress under the cover of darkness. Each soldier checked gear, tightened harnesses, and ran through the plan one last time. They had trained for this mission for months, and now the training met the real thing. The SEALs and Delta Force operators reached the hull and began their climb. They used magnetic grips, climbing lines, and suction devices designed to hold even on oily, rusted steel. Teams rappelled in small groups, moving like shadows. Their ropes made almost no sound. Above them, the cartel fired sporadically, but it was impossible to aim at a ghost. The attackers were patient. They moved slowly and surely until they found a weak point. Entry was surgical. The operators targeted unguarded vents, maintenance hatches, and ventilation shafts. These were the ship's arteries. places that supplied air, power, and access. Teams cut seals, maneuvered through narrow ducts, and opened internal doors from the inside. In some cases, they used quiet cutting charges to make a single clean breach without setting off explosives nearby. In other cases, they slipped in through service corridors already cluttered with cables and pipes. Inside the ship, the air was hot and smelled of chemicals. The corridors were narrow, lit only by the operator's night vision. Teams moved in strict formations, each member covering a specific sector. They used suppressed weapons and short, precise radio calls. When they encountered armed guards, they acted fast and without hesitation. Many skirmishes were over in seconds. The teams used flashbang grenades to stun groups and then secured them before they could react. Every operator had a role. Some moved to clear the labs. Others headed for the hold where hostages were kept. A separate team worked to shut down the reactors and cut power to dangerous systems. Another unit ran to the bridge and engine room to lock down navigation and communications. Coordination was exact. Each team's movement fed into the next, like parts of a machine. From first jamming to full breach, the entire approach took only minutes. The ship that had once ruled the waves now teamed with opposing forces it could not see. The invaders moved through its bowels with calm efficiency. The fortress was no longer a single entity. It had become an operating battlefield under the control of the United States and its finest warriors. With the hull breached and teams inside, the operation entered its most dangerous phase. What followed was a rapid, brutal sweep through the ship, designed to disable the criminal network and free the victims trapped within. 9 minutes of fury, the fortress falls. At 2:30 a.m., the storm inside Jesús Malverde reached its peak. The fortress that had once ruled the Pacific's criminal underworld was now under siege from within. Every corridor echoed with the sound of controlled chaos, and every second mattered. The U.S. forces were executing one of the most complex takedowns in modern naval history. Team Alpha was the first to strike the nerve center. Their target was the bridge, where the cartel's leader had once ruled his empire of poison. Moving in total darkness, they climbed through a maintenance vent and dropped flashbang grenades into the room below. The explosion of light and sound blinded everyone inside. In just 40 seconds, the SEALs stormed the command deck, neutralizing 18 armed guards before a single radio call could be made. The bridge was theirs, and the ship's command system was under U.S. control. The eyes and ears of the fortress were gone. Team Bravo had the most dangerous job below deck. They entered the weapons bay, which was a cramped and booby-trapped nightmare filled with rocket-propelled grenades, landmines, and improvised explosives. Every step could have triggered disaster. Using fiber optic cameras, they scanned for tripwires and mapped the maze before moving an inch. When mercenaries appeared, the team acted fast, using silenced rifles and precision tactics to eliminate 9 defenders. They disarmed the detonators and secured the entire bay, preventing an explosion that could have sunk the ship and everyone on it. Team Charlie moved toward the darkest part of the ship, the cargo hold where civilians were being held captive. They found rows of cages, terrified hostages, and guards using them as human shields. The SEALs switched to night vision and knives, striking with silent precision. The fight was brutal but brief. When it ended, every hostage was alive and every captor was neutralized. In total, 300 people, men, women, and even children, were freed from a life of forced labor and torment. Team Delta went after the heart of the operation, the chemical labs that produced the drugs. Inside were 6 reactors, each capable of creating billions of dollars worth of narcotics. Toxic fumes filled the air, and the risk of explosion was high. The operators moved methodically, shutting down the reactors, securing samples, and locking away critical evidence that would later expose the network behind the fortress. Within minutes, the deadly machinery was silent. Team Echo had the final mission: capture the cartel boss. The fugitive tried to escape through a hidden hatch at the stern with a suitcase full of diamonds and encrypted drives, but he never made it far. Team Echo intercepted him on a maintenance platform and the man who once ruled a floating empire surrendered without a fight, trembling under the cold stare of the soldiers who ended his reign. His billion-dollar empire had fallen. From breach to capture, the entire assault lasted 9 minutes and 32 seconds, and the floating fortress of crime had been destroyed with surgical precision. Every objective was achieved and every hostage was saved. It was a victory gained through training, courage, and coordination that few forces on Earth could match. The battle was over, but the mission was not. As the smoke cleared, investigators and rescue teams moved in, revealing the staggering truth of what this ship had carried and the cost of the darkness it had spread. The aftermath: rescues, secrets, and a trembling cartel boss. The deck of Jesús Malverde was no longer a battlefield. It was now a rescue zone. As dawn began to rise over the Pacific, helicopters from the USS Arlington and the USCG Cutter Stratton descended onto the captured fortress. Medics and rescue teams poured out as the mission shifted from combat to compassion. They moved fast, treating injuries, calming terrified survivors, and checking for dehydration and trauma. Many of the 120 rescued civilians, including 5 Americans who had spent months in captivity, wept. Others just stared, too numb to believe they were free. For all the precision and control of the operation, there had still been a price. 2 Navy SEALs were critically wounded after being injured during the final breach of the chemical lab. Their teammates refused to leave them behind, carrying them through the ship's twisting corridors to the extraction point. They would survive, but their condition was a reminder that even in victory, sacrifice was inevitable. These were the faces of heroism, ordinary men who had risked everything so others could live. Once the wounded were secured, another phase began. Explosive ordnance disposal teams moved methodically through the ship's decks, marking crates, scanning for booby traps, and cataloging the incredible volume of narcotics. The drugs filled entire storage bays, enough to poison nations. Each brick was carefully recorded and prepared for destruction under U.S. supervision. What had once been the cartel's empire of profit was now evidence of their downfall. The surprises did not stop there. In sealed compartments below deck, teams discovered caches of weapons ranging from AK-47s to surface-to-air missiles. These were not tools for protection, but meant for war. Intelligence officers concluded that the cartel had been building a private military at sea capable of defending its operations from any threat. As digital analysts began scanning the command center, another shocking discovery emerged. The encrypted hard drives found on the cartel boss contained a treasure trove of data in the form of secret accounts, encrypted communications, and lists of corrupt officials across Latin America, Europe, and even parts of the United States. The files revealed the full scope of the cartel's global reach, acting as a roadmap for dismantling their network piece by piece. And then there was the cartel boss himself. Once feared across continents, he now stood barefoot, bruised and trembling. His custom-made suit had been torn during his capture, and his silence was heavy with defeat. The man who had enslaved hundreds and trafficked billions was led across the deck in cuffs, hooded, and surrounded by elite soldiers. Cameras aboard the Stratton recorded his extraction as he was loaded onto an MH-60 Seahawk helicopter. He said nothing as it lifted off with his empire collapsing beneath him. By sunrise, Jesús Malverde was stripped of power. What had once symbolized greed, death, and corruption was now a floating grave of criminal ambition. The mission was over, but the message was only beginning to spread. Across the world, cartel leaders, warlords, and traffickers watched in fear as America showed what happens when justice comes from the sky. What do you think about this attack? Comment down below.